Our final speaker for today is Dr. Chris Filardi. His job title is a bit of a mouthful. He is biodiversity scientist for Pacific Programs at the American Museum of Natural History's Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. Chris first showed up in Montana after his undergraduate years when he worked in and around Yellowstone for the Peregrine Fund. And Chris fell in love with the landscapes, the wildlife, and the people of Montana and vowed to return here eventually, which he did after first going back to school. He completed a master's at the Yale School of Environmental Studies and received a PhD in zoology from the University of Washington, where he studied patterns of speciation and the biogeographic history of tropical Pacific flycatchers. Though the majority of his work continues to take place in the Pacific region with projects in the Solomon Islands, Fiji, the Line Islands, and coastal BC, he can now call Montana home. Throughout his career, Chris has maintained a commitment to bridging the realms of research, education, and grassroots wilderness conservation. He has combined research interests in the origins and diversification of life with a commitment to indigenous voices in wilderness conservation. So mixing kind of an active field biology program with development of a series of community-driven natural history and protected areas initiatives, some of which you'll hear about today. Chris is someone who really thinks deeply about biology, the connections between science and conservation, and our place in the natural world, challenging the simple definitions of what it means to be a conservation biologist. Please join me in welcoming him as he presents Data and Daydreams.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you all for being here today. It's a real honor to be here speaking with you, and thanks for hanging in here on this day. You know, I'm like the last guy in line. So does this mic? Do I have to worry about it? So you know what let me just do this here so I don't totally go haywire. But you know what I'm going to share with you today is really more of a conversation than it is a talk with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's a conversation that really began for me, just about 25 years ago. Really, I was sort of this wild-eyed kid who came out of basically the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and stumbled into Bozeman and met Louisa Wilcox, who had to leave. And I was just rip-roaring ready to go. I wanted a job and really started talking about science and how it could apply to, you know, this place I was so passionate about and just exploding with. And, you know, I wouldn't have given me a job then either. But, you know, it continued in talks with people like Ed Abbey and Doug Peacock, who've both provided an incredible ethical compass for me and so many other people. And Terry Tempest Williams as well, with her poetry and her stories. And what I'm going to talk with you or share with you today, I think really gained focus, must be 15 years ago, at some party in the Southwest with Terry Tempest Williams. And I think everybody was putting red lipstick on their lips and gulping down this syrupy sugar water and just puckering up to this blue sky. And hummingbirds, multiple species of hummingbirds were coming and sipping from our tongues. Pretty amazing experience. But that night, Terry told this story. And what she said was, you know, I got this call from Bill Clinton, and he had read my book, Refuge, and it really resonated with him and said, you know, it reminded him of his struggle, his mother's struggle with cancer. And I don't know if you know this book, Refuge, but it's about the natural world sort of as a backdrop for human struggle and both spiritually and more practically. But, you know, Bill Clinton reads this poetic book of mine and said it really resonated with him. He gave me this phone call, and I guess Bill Clinton flew out Air Force One or 1B or something like that. Gets Terry back there, and they're playing pool together. And in the middle of this pool game, he goes, you know, what's important? What should I do? And at least one thing Terry says was wilderness. And the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument is a result of that. And I said, wow. You know, a poet playing pool with the president results in over 1.5 million acres of wilderness. That's something to think about. And I haven't stopped thinking about it. And you know, like most times when you start thinking about your impact and the possibilities of what it means to be a biologist, a conservation biologist, you start thinking about Leopold. And as most of you know, Leopold had an incredible influence on the inclusion of science in natural resource management. But you know, he's best known for the poetry of his love for wild places, the melancholy of watching that fierce green fire die, thinking like a mountain, and the ethic he formulated out of his experiences. You know, he's way better known for Sand County Almanac than he is for game management. And what I want to present to you today is really a question. Is our science leaving room for the kind of passion that has left this sort of legacy? Are we building the sorts of social alliances and social contexts that actually empower our science in the arenas that really affect major social change? You know, we're facing multiple crises here, and the question is our science impeding our ability to do that? And I'm going to do this by, I guess, because Rebecca didn't want me to stand up here and just sort of babble at you guys, just kind of talking off the cuff, which I could do. She said, you better talk a little bit about your work, because she helped me quite a bit with this talk, and I talked to her on the telephone and bugged her a bunch. She said, you know, after I gave her my abstract, she said, well, why don't you talk a little bit about your work? So I'm going to give you two examples. One from the Solomon Islands, and where I think science was misapplied and actually became a hindrance to meaningful conservation action on the ground. And the second, in the temperate rainforests of coastal BC, where I think science was provided a social context where it was incredibly empowered and enabled me and other scientists to become involved in what I think is one of the greatest conservation achievements of really the last century. And that is some of the major conservation gains in the temperate coastal rainforests of British Columbia. So now, the Solomon Islands, just to skip here, get your brain into this, you know, we've been really talking about this region, which I probably should have done, but hey, you know, I work in the Solomons a lot of the time, so. But it is one of the last great tropical island wildernesses on Earth. This is like major grassland systems. Tropical island wilderness is almost gone. It's left almost nowhere on Earth. And this is one of the last great tropical wildernesses on the planet. And the Solomon Islands, for those of you who don't know, is right here, lying directly east of New Guinea. And the Solomons are within Melanesia. And aside from the biodiversity, which I'll talk about in a moment, there are two things of distinction I want to share with you. First, Melanesia is known for incredible patterns of human diversity. The Solomon Islands alone, across this little archipelago, there are nearly 100 distinct languages. Some of these languages are as different as Chinese and German. There is equivalent cultural diversity to match that linguistic diversity. So that's one distinction. The second distinction is that within Melanesia, and particularly within the Solomons, nearly all of the landscapes are held via customary land tenure. So traditional patterns of oral history and consensus-based decision-making govern access and ownership over well over 90% of the landscapes within the Solomons. Just something to keep in your mind. But, you know, after I had been totally dissed by GYC and, you know, went back to school and decided I was going to go off and study biology, what attracted me to the Solomons was biology. And it's a phenomenal place with regard to biology. I mean, I could give you a zillion examples. Incredible endemism, but this guy right here, that's the largest skink in the world. And we're on the other side of Wallace's line here, right? This skink's got a prehensile tail, hangs around grabbing leaves, eating them. It's basically a skink that's turned into a monkey, only found in the Solomons. And I could stand here for the rest of the talk and just do that, which I could do if you guys want. We could go over and over that, but no matter how you slice it, the Solomon Islands are globally significant when it comes to biological diversity. You guys probably know about hotspot analyses to prioritize sites, the ecoregion analysis by WWF that ranked these, you know, that presented these globally significant 200 ecoregions. The Solomons is within one of them. It's tied for the #1 site for bony fish diversity, soft and hard coral diversity, and nudibranch diversity on Earth, the Solomons. Global center of terrestrial diversity for plants, mammal endemism, #1 endemic bird area on Earth. just glows. And the more people have found out about the Solomons, the more it's become a conservation priority. However, when I started working there, all that stuff hadn't happened yet. And as it began to happen, people started saying, well, within the Solomons, where the heck should we work? And you're a biologist, you want to do conservation, you got to figure out where you're going to work. And all these things, the Coral Triangle Initiative, the most recent of them, key biodiversity areas, important bird areas, endemic bird areas, habitat, ecological niche, spatial modeling, evolutionary diversity or potential indices of evolutionary diversity and potential using molecular techniques, all kinds of stuff people have done, and it's just a mess. People struggle to prioritize sites within the Solomons to enable conservation action to focus, right? This is this triage that we all know about. We can't save it all. You know, we cannot save it all. We have to pick the areas where we're going to have the most impact. Well, just as an example, in this crazy sort of frenzy to try to figure out where the heck to work, we even got involved in it, my wife Catherine and I. This is, you know, phylogenetic diversity is this measure of evolutionary depth and potential. It's an index of potential or goodness. And whether you abide or not, there are these numbers. You see New Georgia's got 207, Malaita 336, and these other two groupings, the blue here and the green here, are lower. Well, habitat modeling, this sort of ecological niche modeling, spatial modeling, KBAs, all these other things highlighted these other areas. And I could go through this. Every single prioritization scheme kind of ranked things differently. And while all this was happening, we're sitting there studying the biology, finding it very easy to get funding for biology. But our ultimate goals were conservation. And were conservation of some of the amazing intact richness of this last great wild archipelago. And although it was easy to find funding for work to study where we should work for conservation, it was very difficult to find funding to actually implement conservation work, because people said, we don't know where to work. And one of the amazing things about the Solomons is while all that stuff was happening, what became really clear to me relates to this thing called custom. And that's not misspelled like country kitchen, you know, with a K, that kind of thing. Custom is more a concept than it is a word. It describes human behavior and really philosophy as within biodiversity. And this concept is really significant because, as I said, over 90% of the Solomons is held via customary land tenure. That means that individuals in the landscape, over 84% of which live by subsistence livelihoods, those individuals in the landscape who are the resource users, really the resource definers, are also the resource owners. It's a huge opportunity that became very apparent to us as we were working in the Solomons, trying to figure out where to work. With the money we had, struggling to try to convince people we needed to work with people. At the same time, those folks, despite these subsistence livelihoods, were butting up against a modern world and cash economies. School fees, access to modern medicine, and just things like radios to hear about the world around them that was rapidly encroaching in cost money. And really one of the only ways for people to get money was through raw extraction of natural resources. Now, I'm not going to go into this here. Some of you may have heard some of my other talks about some of the conflict in the Solomons and the logging industry there. There's amazing timber in the Solomons. It's highly valued, and due to a quirk in Solomon Islands law, these customary landholders, some of which you can't read, essentially half dozen folks can sign off on what is really the property of 6,000 to 10,000 people. So customary law would say no one person owns any of this. There really isn't even a word for land ownership in most of those 100 languages, all the ones I know about. I've looked at probably 30 or 40 of them pretty well. There's no word for ownership when it comes to land. It's all communal. You're holding, you're stewarding. These logging companies come in, and because of this quirk in Solomon Islands law, essentially a few folks who usually don't even live out in these places can sign off the rights to timber. It's a messy situation. It involves prostitution, indebtedness, lying, government graft. It's a mess. There's an unraveling that happens in these places, these communities. Once this happens where they are, they're completely disempowered. They're fighting over firewood. They don't have clean water, selling their daughters off to folks in the logging companies to pay their debts for fuel and all this. This caused an incredible social unraveling. There were pretty significant social strife and actually military confrontation and military coup. The economy completely collapsed. And in this vacuum, while conservation organizations were still saying we need more science to figure out where to work, there was incredible opportunity. And as much as this was a crisis, people were ready for alternatives. And just to make a long story short, what we decided upon is something we call community conservation agreements. These are basically partnerships with communities that are very transparent. They're a quid pro quo agreement where for some conservation outcome, if you guys can say you're not going to sign on with any logging companies, we'll partner with you guys to help empower essentially your traditional decision-making mechanisms. Happy to talk about that after the talk. It's not really the point of this. But the key point here is that we were linking development with biodiversity and cultural survival. So we had some strange bedfellows that the conservation world didn't always really like the European Union, the World Bank. They were the only ones willing to fund this stuff. Some of the malaria control folks have funded some of this work. And the key is that these community conservation agreements, because they rely on traditional decision making, they're completely decoupled from biology, at least at the start. At least at the start. So just to jump to kind of the punchline here, these green areas show the sites that essentially people were willing to fund within the Solomons. We could not submit proposals to the bingos, right, these big organizations. I've worked for them, so I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful, and these are the only sites they would accept. Now, this was the main site. This island here, Tetapari, is the largest intact uninhabited island in the tropical Pacific. It's phenomenal. Some of you guys have probably seen a video I have. It's a fairly phenomenal place. Look, check it out on the web. We've got a website there. It's phenomenal. No one wanted to fund it because it wasn't popping out in these schemes that related to global priority setting agendas of these big, basically corporate environmental interests. And then we had other areas that were highly threatened, had a lot of potential, where communities were actually approaching us to come work. They wanted these CCAs in these areas. The long and short is we funded this through those development initiatives, which is really the only thing that enabled some successes here. This island here, in the time we've been working in the Solomons, went from 80% forested to approximately 10% forested. And most of the 10% is just along a little spine in the middle of the island. It's pretty, I mean, I don't mean to be a downer and everything. There's been some beautiful success here. But by investing, being forced to invest in some of these other areas, particularly here where there was very little threat, we were essentially, we had huge losses out here. Now, I'm not saying that conservation is, I mean, science doesn't have any meaning. I'm really not saying that. We're investing in science. This is the Imbu Rano Lodge. It's a scientific research and education center. It's meant to bring together international researchers and national researchers to kind of bring science into the dialogue, both the development dialogue and the conservation dialogue in the Solomons. But the role of biology in this place was really humble. And if you wanted to follow these prioritization schemes, you needed to start with people. What's happening now is we've got traction. A lot of other people have said this today. Once something starts working, other people want to be a part of it. And just to kind of give you a sense of why I think science didn't work, why I think science was very disempowering and an impediment, it's just the biology of the Solomons is very unsuited to ranking. You can't rank. It's just the nature of these archipelagos. They're each sort of unique areas and very unsuited to ranking. And I think we'll find that increasingly as we sort of insularize continental systems. We find the same thing. Ranking becomes very arbitrary. There was a very poor context in the Solomons to enable the kind of science people were wanting to use to guide conservation, meaning that there really was no capacity to even get that word out. These people, there was no resonance at the government level. There's no legal mechanism to acknowledge any of this. It was falling on deaf ears on the ground. Maybe guiding us, but it shouldn't have been guiding our actions. The scale of the threats, both temporally and spatially, were so intense that just science, it was impossible for science to be able to respond on those time and spatial scales. And then lastly, the socioeconomic systems within the Solomon Islands, this customary land tenure, the consensus-based decision-making just was completely just unresponsive to science. So I want to just a positive. I want to switch to a positive example, and then just kind of quick punchline after that, and then I'm done. So you can take a stretch a little bit, and then we'll go whatever, have a beer together. But the Great Bear Rainforest is situated along the coast of British Columbia. It's a relatively narrow strip in terms of the scale of North America, but this is one of the last great wild places on the continent. It's really one of the largest temperate rainforest systems left on Earth. And this is an example of where I think natural history first empowered culture, and then culture empowered science. And the result, I think, has been well, stunning, to be honest. I've been very minimally involved in it, but the people on the ground are achieving great, great things. So it's a place where there are these iconic species, like, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You have amazing grizzly populations, but you've also got these weird things, like these Kermode bears, these spirit bears, eating weird races of chum salmon. I mean, that's a chum salmon. That's like a 14-pound salmon. These are big black bears. I mean, that's a black bear, Kermode bear. And you got wolves flipping abalones on these neap tides, wolverines down on the beaches, foraging on little mountain goat kids on the beach. I mean, just crazy cool stuff. And huge threats, huge, huge threats. This is one of those cedars, like I can't remember who it was who was mentioning these giant old cedars. I think it was Dave. These are these 2,000, 1,800-year-old cedars, western red cedars, that were being sold off for phone books in Europe. This was devastating. When I arrived in this ecosystem, again, this is right after I just had left over there in Bozeman, and I was still humming from that. And I came up in here just hitting the ground thinking, how am I going to be a scientist out here? And to be honest, conservation biology at this point was just a little baby. It was just barely there. But what became very clear almost instantly was that to be anybody as a biologist, to have even any voice, I mean, at this point, this system right here, what people called it was the war in the woods. It was First Nation people, government people, different sectors of the environmental community were literally violently fighting one another. People were dying. It was serious. It was the war in the woods. And what became clear was that the fabric that stitched together cultural history with these places was really powerful. There was something there that was seeming to divide people that, well, I didn't know this at the time, to be honest. I didn't. I'd love to say I thought of this at the time, but I didn't really. What started happening was I started listening to stories. And people started telling stories about organisms that shouldn't be there. People started telling stories about these frogs with little tails. And they had a story about why the tail was there. There were songs about these frogs with tails on them. And you guys all know this thing is Sciaphus truei, the tailed frog, Rocky Mountain. I mean, this isn't the Rocky Mountain one. This is the coastal one. But when I was up there, they weren't supposed to get anywhere beyond here. No way. No tailed frogs beyond there. And I heard these stories. So really, honestly, it's a huge failure of invention on my part. I had students with me. I was a student myself. We had to go out and do something. So we just went out and started looking for tailed frogs. Literally like that, just looking under stuff. And the tadpoles have these suction cups and they stick on the rocks in these, have you guys seen these things? Fairly phenomenal organisms. It's tough to see an adult, but in looking for these frogs, we found other stuff too. This is a culturally modified tree. This is the old big cedar planks for the longhouses. They would take from live trees, and they had these nurseries of trees. And this is evidence of occupation. These First Nations, part of why they were so angry is that people were coming up there trying to redefine that place, and they had never been involved in treaty negotiations. The Heiltsuk Nation, who I work with now and worked with then, had one of the largest traditional territories in all of British Columbia. And they're sitting on about 100, they had 160 acres at one point. This was a nation of 15,000 people that was reduced to 2,000. Reduced to 200, by disease and everything at the turn of the century. And when I was there, it was about 1,500. And we started finding this stuff. And also, we found lots of tailed frogs. That's a conservative line. There's tailed frogs all through this place. And what was incredible is when we were out there with First Nations people doing this stuff, they were finding tailed frogs, but they were also finding their own history. They were finding these reckoning points for their stories, for their songs, and there were these young people, some of them 10, 12 years old, were taking ownership over these places. And some elder people, like this guy, Ed Martin, began seeing these science stories as a point of healing. He didn't really care about the science, you know, he didn't. But he started seeing these, and there are 100 Eds up and down the coast, right? Started seeing these scientific stories as a point of healing, as a way to call a truce for this war in the woods, as a way to show that there was some synergy there. And that translated into a movement, a First Nations movement that I believe, and I think many others would agree with me, resulted in this incredible conservation gain. And I could go into the details here. I don't really want to. I'm not going to. But this is essentially the region. That's 21 million acres, essentially, this in the black line here, right there, 21 million acres. Over 5 are these dark green areas. Those are fully protected. And another couple are in these bright green areas. These are biodiversity areas where you can do a little bit of stuff, but there's going to be no law. It's a huge gain. There are problems with it, but it's a huge gain. And it was this social consensus that got us there. But that's not the story I want to tell today. What I want to talk to you about now is the context, the beginnings of that sort of natural history empowering culture, and how now that's really empowered science. And where we've turned now is, in the wake of that big deal, this 5 million acres and the whole 21 million acre area, what we're starting to do is to try to develop these value-driven or First Nation-driven, this is a Heiltsuk-driven, science-based ecological monitoring initiative. So this is getting Heiltsuk people out into these landscapes to collect really rigorous monitoring data to essentially be able to legitimize and implement their values. This doesn't always work in maybe what I, as a wilderness guy, think should happen. It might not always happen, but to be honest, it's incredibly powerful. And the kind of trust, vision, faith that comes out of this has been remarkable. I just want to show you one example. So one of the things we've been monitoring in some of the drainages are grizzly bears. I figured I'd talk about grizzly bears because at least it's something that's here. I could talk about clams or crabs, but that's a little beyond the reach. And we, you know, similar to some of the other studies you've been seeing here, these are hair snares, really crappy pictures because I stole them out of somebody else's report. This is one of our guys who is doing this work, Jordan, and this is another Heiltsuk guy here. But anyway, went out there and started non-invasively sampling grizzly bears as part of this overall watershed monitoring program, looking at salmon, looking at crabs, all kinds of cool stuff. Well, started getting these results back, and long story short, these are iconic bear areas. This is the Brooks River in Alaska. This is the Kutsumateen, all of Banff National Park. This is an estimate for all of Banff. You know, see, the Quay is kind of ranking up there, and this is a little 18 kilometers of river, a little estuary, tiny area. This area is orders of magnitude smaller than the areas that these are both drawing on. And then in 2008, it's ranking up there with the Kutsumateen, which is one of the largest drainages on the whole. This was a significant thing. The Heiltsuk were proud, were blown away. And again, this reinvigorated voice. There were all sorts of other data that was associated with this. They've been involved in a mapping program. You can imagine all the cool stuff conservation biology can do. It started doing it now, right? In this context, all the cool stuff you guys either know how to do or I don't know how to do this stuff. But this essentially started echoing through these communities. And their cultural rediscovery programs started incorporating these scientific stories into their programs. They began talking about the values they wanted implemented and the science and how to do the science, how to build capacity for the science that could support these value-based decisions that management is all about. And now there's a management plan for the Quay River. There's a full management plan that's become a model for how all of these conservancies are going to be managed. And it's Heiltsuk driven. There are some things in here that we wouldn't care about. You know, there's stuff about, I mean, like, it's funny what happens. But anyway, the idea is there's a management plan now, and there's a slowly growing capacity to actually have that management plan be science-based, right? That's what we want to have happen. If I would have been smart enough to try this back then, it would have failed. But I was just ignorant and followed this story about a frog with a tail on it. I didn't even really know what tailed frogs were, to be honest, back then. And I thought, a frog with a tail? Maybe it's some weird story. But anyway, that's the success story. And as I said, when I first went up to BC, conservation biology was just a little baby. It was just after, in the mid-'80s, the biological diversity crisis was really, you guys probably have read or are reading all those sort of now seminal papers, which, boy, does that make us feel old. Yeah, geez, even me, gosh. But right on the boot heels of that is this paper that you all, I'm sure, have read by Michael Soule, where he kind of compared, he created this idea of we need a discipline, a crisis-oriented discipline that's synthetic, that accepts these that accepts things like diversity is just good, let's move forward. We got to do this. Just like cancer biology, that accepts uncertainty. And it's a discipline that we sometimes forget, that orbits the known, the unknown, but also the unknowable. This is something that was talked about. It was right at the heart of what invented why we're all here right now. And we've done a lot here, right? We've focused a lot on this. Climate change is a great example. We went from here to here with climate change. And you hear now these incredible cries for all of us, each and every one of you, to get out there and talk about this. Get out there and be better at communicating what we know. And that is important. I mean, this is a statement that was, this is true, man. I mean, if it keeps going down like this, no one's going to be calling us the greatest generation. I mean, that's over, at least my generation. This is important, right? And there's precedent for this. There is incredible precedent for this. You think about Rachel Carson, and she was a biologist, right? She really, she stepped out of that, but she was a biologist. And look at what she did. I mean, people have criticized her DDT thing, but I think that's silly. It's incredible what she did. But there's more to it than that. There's a lot more to it than that. And I want to look at this a little more closely before we finish up here. So these are a little bit false, but just bear with me on this. This is more kind of of something to kind of, I hope we talk about this after that. I'll throw darts at this, If this was a dartboard, we could start winging them right now. But I would argue, sort of the known is more these science-driven things, like climate change. This is something we detected. We have this science-driven agenda now that we're trying to actualize. That's part of this known place there. There's this unknown place where we've got some value decisions like we need to keep, the little mud puppy in the pond or whatever it is, the little those sink foil things on the scree slopes that all those people in the Appalachian Trail were walking over. These are sort of science-based problems where we've made a values decision and we pursue them. But down here we have passion. Down here, this is all about passion. And as much as the known, when we're talking about biodiversity, climate change, that's the known. We're responding to what we know. Wilderness, it's all about mystery. It's down here. And what I want to submit to you guys is that it's here that we build social capital, right? And by social capital, I mean that upwelling of consensus, of human spirit, of movement at the social level that we can then spend in these other realms to implement. It's here that we build that. We don't build that up there. And I worry that we've forgotten that. I do. I forget it sometimes. And I worry that as a community, we've lost a little bit of that. And I hope we talk about that tonight. Because the examples I want to present to you, I better flip this over. The examples I want to present to you relate to people like Marty Murie. She was a gatherer. I was fortunate enough to meet her. And what impressed me most about Marty, she was a gatherer of people, incredible personalities that she gathered through her life. It was the life she lived that enabled her to kind of precipitate that gathering that resulted in this incredible thing, right? The Wilderness Act is amazing. It is. And I would argue the ESA is similar. Imagine the ESA. Do you think they'd pass it today? No way. If you did the economics of that, there's no way. People wouldn't do it, I don't think. But this act, and I would argue again that the ESA it wasn't really about science. These weren't science, these were organic, vision-keeping kinds of acts. But I believe they've deeply empowered science. The kind of stuff Mike Scott's talked about, the kind of stuff most of the talks today have talked about, relates to the empowerment that science has here, it doesn't have that globally. And all of the problems we're addressing relate to global issues. We need to act locally and think globally and all, whatever you call that whole thing from the bumper sticker. But these were not scientific acts, and it was that gathering that really resulted in them. And I don't know if you guys have read it. It's not a very good book. How am I doing for time? It's not a very good book, but it's called The Wilderness Warrior. It's this biography of Theodore Roosevelt by David Brinkley, and I think it came out in August or something like that. And it focuses on him as his wilderness life, his life as a naturalist and an advocate for wilderness. And you know, not much stuck in my head from that book, except one sort of unforgettable thing. And it was Muir and Roosevelt were up in the snows of Yosemite in 1903, and they wumped up into there, and Muir lights this huge pine snag on fire. How cool, you mean that was the day, man, when you go out there and light a pine on fire. And they just rumpused around this thing like little boys all night long. And following that, Roosevelt put Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove under federal control. And Roosevelt didn't just buddy up with people like Muir. He surrounded himself with some of the best scientists of his day. And I have a quote here that, I think I have this quote here, that, I mean, it's remarkable. This guy, Frank Chapman, that he buddied up with, just believed that there was no question that our nation had to create federal reserves. He was this scientist, one of the first people to say to protect birds, you know, the bird feather trade. He really inspired the beginnings of Audubon. Anyone who's ever heard of Audubon, this sort of droll, very kind of poorly spoken but fierce advocate at the American Museum of Natural History, actually, started all that stuff. He was buddies with Roosevelt. Roosevelt loved him. And he had little sayings like, a bird in the bush is worth two in the hand. Habitat's where it's at. And Roosevelt actualized that stuff. He actualized that stuff through these relationships. And I have a question, another one. Can we be the guys on the bully pulpit, the bush burners, the Frank Chapmans who, you know, toiling away in the lab? Can we be all those things as scientists? I don't think we can. I really don't think we can. And I think we need to ask ourselves, who are our inspirers? You know, where have our greatest yops come from in our lives as professionals? And this is that guy, Ed Martin, that I mentioned. He was holding the salmon there with his little crippled hands. And this is his last potlatch. This is his last potlatch. And I remember him being so nervous he wouldn't be able to hold the rattles because he's got these crippled hands. And you know, Ed built this incredible legacy of relationships. I got to look at this because, or I'll go haywire. He built this incredible legacy of relationships, this shared vision that really persists. And it's not unlike Marty Murie, Roosevelt, and others. We all need vehicles for our science to really carry the tides of social change. We need our science empowered by vision. And this is Ed's mortuary pole. It was the first mortuary pole put up in Heiltsuk territory in 100 years. Look at those hands. Look at those hands on that pole. You know, Ed's hands will be remembered as strong, as bold, not knotted and weak. I got to read this because I get emotional when I think about this guy. These are the kinds of legacies we need to continue to build and empower our actions and our science. This mortuary pole is inside this huge conservancy that was going to be cut. It's right there. It's in a place that was going to fall down when he died, and it's not. It's protected now with that pole in it. Now, big ideas often stumble on the ground, whether they're science-based or not. That's where the real costs are paid. We've heard that over and over again today. Economics often trumps a Great Bear, biodiversity, wilderness, or vision itself. I believe we need big, uncompromised ideas that our science has to catch up to, that we work toward because our science needs to get there. or that our science has the humility and courage to speak through other perspectives when it needs to enable itself to be empowered by other perspectives when it has to. Science is this incredibly powerful means to show us what is. And we're getting better and better, a more and more refined understanding of what is. But science tells us nothing about what ought to be. And I think we may be in need of more investment in social partnership, in alliances, with great spokespeople, with humanist endeavors, and with motivators, great societal motivators. And lastly, wilderness is really a reckoning point. It's a reservoir for the human soul. And with the change and challenges we face, I think a dedication to things like wilderness is really an example of what I mean by the unknowable, inspiring the kinds of vision and actions we need to face what are incredibly daunting possibilities for the future. I thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions and keep talking. Thank you. So it's really not like a talk that you ask questions about, I guess, but I'd love to, whatever, converse with people about it later. If there aren't any questions now, don't feel bad. I don't know what the heck I'd ask after that. Yeah.
The river in British Columbia, can you give us sort of a sense of where it is?
The Quay River.
Quay River, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, look, I forgot the little frog. It's an endemic frog. Well, that's you know what this is? Mystery, man. Frog doesn't have a name. I mean, you could call it Chester or something, but it doesn't have a scientific name. It's in this south central portion of the BC coast.
Okay.
And it's actually a place, I'm going to show it to you because it's a place you can visit where this stuff is really actualized. You can see on the ground, this is part of the Quay estuary, that's the river, but you can see on the ground where all this stuff is happening. There's a big house there. There are cultural rediscovery programs every summer. The Quay River is just right in here. This is the Hakai recreation area, if you've ever heard of that. Hakai Pass is in here. This is the beginning of the Inland Passage right here. All the cruise ships just duck in right here and they follow the Inland Passage all the way up.
That's why I asked the question, because we've got a trip to Alaska planned.
Yeah, you'll go right by the Quay. You'll go right by the Quay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, let's see. I guess I'm wondering what we might do in a case like the United States, where culture is, there isn't that social capital to draw from in so many cases. You know, we're doing whatever we do, you know, head to the Southgate Mall or whatever. What can we build on in those, in our case?
That's a great question. And I guess my response to that is similar to my response, well, I'm not going to do that, sorry. My response to that is really that I believe, you know, this idea, the kind of approach I'm talking about is big. And it's not necessarily going to work in all these little places on the ground, little instances on the ground, but I do think it can resonate powerfully in local places. I mean, the northwestern Montana, what's recently happened up there really is the child of that building that kind of social capital in the unknowable realm. And this, I'm talking about Tester's Bill and the way those areas were included in that, whether you agree with them or not, was, I think, a powerful example of people spending over a decade just banging the drum for that social capital. I mean, some of those people, I mean, I can tell, Rick Bass was part of that. He's a good friend of mine. He didn't care about the biology. I mean, he didn't know about it. He wanted to, but he, you know, what he did was build, he and many others, just dedicated themselves to that social capital. So it worked in that small sphere. I agree with you that maybe on the national level, when we think about what we are as a constituency, the majority of us, you may be dead right. I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that if we're brave enough, you know, if there are people who are brave enough to just say, this, what I'm talking about needs no defense, just defenders. It doesn't. This is what, you know, we need people to say that. You know, I'm willing to say that, but no one will listen to me. But, you know, if we have great leaders who start saying that stuff, I think a lot of people would follow. But you're right that the United States is a challenge for building that kind of social capital. But I guess I have to believe that if we can sort of simplify our message and link it with some of these more humanist messages that actually do resonate, I believe we can make a lot of progress. Instead of saying carbon this and emissions and all that, if we start talking about our legacy and what it means to be you know, a member of this society, I mean, I don't know how to solve that problem. But what we're doing now sure isn't working. I mean, I'm supposed to be going to Copenhagen. I'm not going to Copenhagen. I mean, it's not worth the carbon, whatever, if you want to think about it that way. It's really not. It's a mess what's happening over there. It's just, it's fighting over crumbs is what it's doing. It really is going to have very little impact. We need another solution. I'm not sure I answered your question. I guess I basically agree with you, but I have to believe that.
Yeah, I guess I'm hoping I'm not right eventually. You know, that we can gather around this.
And maybe we don't all have, maybe the part of it is we don't all have to gather around everything. And this is something I've had big discussions with Mike Soule and a couple of other friends of mine at the Nature Conservancy about, I sometimes feel really uncomfortable with the conservation agenda being called a movement. I don't know if you noticed my abstract. I don't think it's a movement. I don't. I mean, my interest has always been in wilderness and always will be. And my science is just science. And that, everybody doesn't have to believe that. I do, and for me that resonates. And I think there is a message there. It's not going to work everywhere, but it might. But if we all kind of capture those kinds of more social messages to drive our science and our more directed action, maybe we'll make more progress. I'm sorry, you had a... No, I'm not done, but I should shut up. Yeah.
Going in, like you establish these relationships with the Native people, but with the wars going on between the Native people and federal agencies and private industry, like how did you go in and like first start to build those relationships, both in Solomon Islands and in Canada?
I just, with passion, I just loved those places. I needed them so desperately. And I mean, that's just plain and simple. Just, I mean, I was so happy when I met this guy, Doug Peacock. I don't know if you know who he is, because he just unapologetically needed Glacier, Yellowstone. He needed bears. And that was a map for me. So I literally went into those places just passionate, and I needed them. I needed them wild, and I needed people in them with relationships in them for partnership. And that's infectious. I mean, it's honest. It's some people hate it, but some people love it. And you know, I didn't make alliances with everybody, but the alliances that were made, and it wasn't just me. There was a community of people, right? Once you get in there, there's communities of people. No one person can do any of this. And the biggest things that have happened to me as a whatever I am, conservation practitioner, biologist, whatever, have been when I've simply kind of rubbed elbows with something. It hasn't been some controlled thing. My biggest failures in the Solomons were when I was controlling the whole thing. That's when it was a mess. It's when I was just an engaged, passionate player in this fabric. That's when things went really well. And it resonates with what, I'm sorry I forgot your name, but what you were talking about conflict and all that stuff being important. I mean, it was important to embrace conflict and willingly accept actually instigating conflict. Because often without doing that, there's no resolution in these really factious kinds of situations. And every single one of you can do this. You know, it doesn't take training. It really doesn't. You know, because I can't do all this stuff. I don't know how to do these maps. I didn't know how to, I really didn't. But you get out there and you believe in something, and it's a gathering, because there are going to be other people who aren't as good at just whatever as I am, and you build those alliances. And the trick for me, the difficulty for me, and I think many people, is building alliances outside of our value sets. Because I think that's where we really make big progress. And people have talked about that all day today. And I'm not saying it's easy, but that's where you make real progress. And I love what Mike Scott said. I mean, have a meal. Take someone somewhere that you love. You know, and just literally getting all those private landowners and sitting down for a meal and trying to get them in the same room. And just be persistent. Who knows? Who knows what that'll result in? As they say in the Solomons, Beto, finis now.